For 9 years, the boy touched his ear. Every specialist said the same thing. Nothing we can do. His father spent $10 million, traveled 3 continents, and begged the world's top doctors to look again. They all shook their heads. Then a maid who earned $14 an hour noticed something no one else did, and what she pulled out of that child's ear will leave you breathless with rage and hope. Evan Freeman was a billionaire. Penthouse suites, private islands, wealth most people couldn't fathom, but every doctor told him his son Douglas had been born deaf. 9 years old, never heard a single word. Evan tried everything: Johns Hopkins, Switzerland, Tokyo. Audiologists who charge $15,000 per consultation. They ran CT scans, MRIs, and genetic testing. All of them said the same thing: congenital, irreversible, move on. But Evan couldn't move on because Douglas was all he had left. His wife Mitchell died from complications 3 days after giving birth to that boy. So Evan kept searching, kept writing checks, and kept praying for a miracle. What he didn't know, the miracle wasn't coming from a medical journal. It was coming from the woman he just hired to scrub his marble floors. Palmer Watkins was a maid, 26 years old, no college degree, no medical license, just a woman trying to keep her grandmother out of a state facility. But she noticed something about Douglas that every expert had overlooked, something dark in his ear. Something is wrong. And one afternoon, while Evan was in a board meeting, she made a decision that would either save that child's hearing or land her in prison. What happened next? You need to hear this story to the end. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now so more people can see what happens when courage meets compassion. And subscribe, because what Palmer does next will absolutely break your heart before it heals it. Real quick, drop your city and country in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know where this story is reaching people. Seriously, where are you watching from? Now back to the story, because things are about to get emotional. The Freeman estate sprawled across 60 acres of land on Freedom Way. From the gate, it looked like something out of a magazine. Stone architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows catching the afternoon sun, rose gardens manicured by a team of 5. But inside, silence. Not the comfortable kind, not the kind that feels like peace. This silence was suffocating, oppressive, like grief had settled into the walls and refused to leave. Servants moved through the hallways like ghosts. Their shoes barely made a sound. They'd learned fast. Mr. Freeman preferred quiet. No radios hummed in the kitchen, no TVs flickered in the staff quarters, no voices rose above a whisper. Just silence. And somewhere in that silence, a father was breaking apart piece by piece. Evan Freeman spent most nights in his study, staring at the oil painting above the stone fireplace. There she was, Mitchell, his wife, her face frozen in time, her eyes still warm, still full of life. Next to her, a younger version of himself, looking like he believed the world made sense. And between them, Douglas, just 2 years old in the portrait. The painting had been commissioned from photographs, a family that had never actually stood together in the same room. Mitchell died 3 days after giving birth, but Evan needed to see what might have been. What should have been. Mitchell died from sepsis, infection that spread too fast, treatment that came too late. Evan had been standing right there when her hand went cold in his. She'd been trying to say something, her lips moving, forming words, but nothing came out. Silent, just like their son would be. Evan never stopped blaming himself. If he'd chosen a different hospital, if he'd demanded they check her again, if he'd been more careful, more insistent, more present, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe Douglas would be different. The guilt lived in his chest like a weight he couldn't put down, couldn't lift, couldn't escape. So he did the only thing that made sense to him. He spent money, more than $10 million, the best audiologists on the planet, flights to Europe, Asia, consultations that cost more than most people's yearly salary. Every specialist said the same thing. Your son's deafness is congenital. There is no cure. You have to accept this. At some point, hope had stopped feeling like love and started feeling like self-harm. But Evan didn't know how to stop. Accept it. How could he accept that his boy would grow up in silence forever? How could he accept that Douglas would never hear, "I'm sorry your mother isn't here to hold you"? So Evan kept searching, kept draining accounts, kept holding on to hope that somewhere, someone had the answer. He didn't realize the answer wasn't in a hospital. It was standing at his front door with empty pockets and a heart full of something he'd forgotten existed: compassion. Her name was Palmer Watkins, and she was about to shatter everything. Palmer Watkins arrived on a Thursday morning in September. The sky was pale, the kind of pale that makes the world feel washed out and tired. The Freeman mansion was a tomb dressed up like a palace. Gold fixtures caught the light from crystal chandeliers. Marble floors stretched from room to room, polished so perfectly you could see your reflection staring back at you. Persian rugs that cost more than cars, furniture imported from France, art on every wall, the kind that belonged in museums. But none of it mattered because the house felt dead. Every room held silence like it was a rule written in stone. The kitchen staff moved without speaking. The groundskeepers trimmed hedges with electric tools that barely hummed. Even the clocks seemed quieter here, their ticking muffled, swallowed by the weight of everything unsaid. It wasn't peace. It was suffocating. Evan had turned Mitchell's art studio on the second floor into something that looked like a shrine. Her easel still stood by the window, brushes waiting in glass jars, half-finished paintings leaning against the walls. Her favorite sweater draped over the back of a chair. A coffee mug with her lipstick still on the rim sat on the table, untouched for 9 years. Evan went in there some nights and just sat in the dark. He didn't paint. He didn't touch anything. He just breathed in the air and pretended she was still there. Douglas moved through the house like a ghost no one was allowed to acknowledge. 9 years old, small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet sadness. He wore expensive clothes that hung loose on his frame. A tutor came twice a week to teach him sign language in the library. The rest of the time, Douglas wandered. He'd stand by windows and stare at nothing. He'd sit on the stairs and watch the staff pass by without seeing him. He touched his right ear constantly, a habit no one questioned anymore. Every servant knew the rules. Mrs. Bella made sure of it on their first day. Do not look the boy in the eyes. Do not touch him. Do not try to comfort him. Do not speak to him unless answering a direct question, which he would never ask because he couldn't hear your response anyway. Do not pity what money cannot fix. The last maid who broke those rules, who dared to smile at Douglas and ruffle his hair, was gone by the end of the week. No explanation. Just gone. So the staff learned to move around Douglas like he was furniture. They cleaned rooms he was in without acknowledging his presence. They set his meals down and walked away. They saw him wince when he touched his ear, saw him cry silently in corners, saw him fold paper into shapes and leave them on windowsills like messages to someone who would never answer. And they said nothing. Because this was what Mr. Freeman paid them to do. Stay quiet. Stay distant. Let the boy suffer in silence, because that's all anyone knew how to do anymore. The mansion was a prison made of marble and money, and everyone inside it was slowly dying. Listen, if you love your mom, you need to subscribe right now, because at the end of this story, I'm revealing one thing that the medical establishment doesn't want you to know. There's a reason those specialists kept telling Evan there was no hope, and when I show you what was really in those medical files at the end, you'll realize this was never about medicine. It was about money. Every scan, every consultation, every moment they told him to give up was part of something darker. So if you want to see the truth behind the biggest medical betrayal ever documented, subscribe now and stay until the end. Trust me, the reveal is worth it. Palmer Watkins was on her knees scrubbing the lobby floor of an office building in Gateway City when the sun came up. It was 5:17 in the morning. Her back hurt. Her hands were raw from the industrial cleaner. She had another job interview at 9 a.m., which meant she had 3 hours to finish this floor, take the bus across town, change into the one decent dress she owned, and somehow look like someone worth hiring. She didn't believe in luck. She believed in survival, and survival meant being invisible. It meant showing up early, staying late, never complaining, never asking for more than you were given. It meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut, because the moment you made yourself visible, the moment you asked for help, that's when the world reminded you that people like you didn't matter. The nursing home bill sat in her purse like a bomb waiting to go off. $8,700 a month for her grandmother's care. Palmer made $3,200 a month working 3 different cleaning jobs, scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, wiping down windows that other people looked through without seeing her. The math never worked. Every month she went deeper into debt. The eviction notice had come last week, 2 months behind on rent. They were going to put her grandmother in a state facility if Palmer could not come up with the money. She'd seen those places, understaffed, underfunded, people lying in their own waste waiting for someone to care. Her grandmother deserved better. But deserving didn't mean anything when you were poor. Palmer had learned that lesson twice already, once with her cousin Louise, once with her brother Cooper. Louise had been deaf, just like everyone said Douglas was. They'd grown up together, learned sign language together, built a world where silence wasn't loneliness. Palmer remembered helping the clinic nurse flush wax from Louise's ears when he was a kid, remembered the way they angled the light, the way they never rushed. She'd learned to read pain in his face, the subtle signs that something was wrong even when he couldn't voice it. Then a car accident when Palmer was 19. She walked away with a broken arm. Louise didn't walk away at all. She still saw his face sometimes when she closed her eyes, still heard the sound of metal crushing, glass shattering, her own voice screaming his name into a silence he'd never escape. Cooper died 2 years later. A fever that wouldn't break. An infection the clinic missed because they didn't have time to run the right tests. By the time Palmer scraped together enough money for a real hospital, it was too late. The doctor said a second opinion 3 days earlier might have saved him. Might have, but they didn't have 3 days. They didn't have the money. So Cooper died, and Palmer learned that being poor didn't just mean going without. It meant watching people you loved disappear because the world decided they weren't worth saving. She finished scrubbing the floor at 7:45, caught the bus at 8:10, arrived at the gates of Freedom Way at 8:52, and everything changed. The iron gates were taller than trees. The driveway stretched so far she couldn't see the house from the road. Fountains, gardens, stone sculptures that probably cost more than her entire life. Palmer stood there in her cheap dress and worn shoes, staring at a world she'd never touch, never belong to, never understand. But she needed this job. So she walked through those gates like she had every right to be there, even though both of them knew she didn't. Mrs. Bella met Palmer at the servants' entrance. She was a tall woman, sharp around the edges, with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. Her uniform was pressed, her shoes were polished. Everything about her said control, order, rules that couldn't be bent. "You'll address me as Mrs. Bella. You'll arrive at 7 a.m. You'll leave when I tell you to leave. You'll clean the East Wing on Mondays and Wednesdays, the West Wing on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the common areas on Fridays. You do not touch Mr. Freeman's study, you do not enter Mrs. Freeman's studio, and you do not, under any circumstances, interact with the boy." Palmer nodded, keeping her face blank, her voice quiet. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Bella's eyes narrowed. "I'm serious about the boy. Mr. Freeman's son is not your concern. You clean around him, you do not look at him, you do not speak to him, you do not touch him, you do not try to help him. The last girl who worked here thought she could be kind, thought she could smile at him, ruffle his hair, make him feel seen. She lasted 3 days. I understand. Do you?" Mrs. Bella stepped closer, her voice dropping. "This house has rules for a reason. Mr. Freeman has spent millions trying to fix that child. Doctors, specialists, people with degrees you couldn't pronounce. If they couldn't help him, what makes you think you can? So you stay in your lane. You clean, you leave, you collect your paycheck. That's all." And the boy wanders, slips away from his tutors, drifts through rooms. If you see him, you keep cleaning and pretend you don't. Palmer felt the words land like stones in her chest. Stay in your lane. That's all people like her were good for. Cleaning up messes, staying invisible, pretending not to notice when something was wrong. "Follow me," Mrs. Bella said, turning sharply. "I'll show you where the supplies are kept." They walked through hallways that felt like museums. Paintings on the walls, vases on tables, everything expensive, everything untouchable. Palmer kept her eyes down, her steps quiet. Then she saw him, a boy standing at the end of the hallway, small and still, like he was part of the furniture. Douglas. He wore a blue sweater that looked too big. His hair was messy, and his hand was pressed against his right ear, his face twisted in pain. Their eyes met for just a second. One heartbeat, maybe two. And Palmer felt something crack open inside her chest. She knew that expression. She'd seen it before. Luis used to look like that before the headaches got so bad he couldn't stand. That wasn't the face of someone born deaf. That was the face of someone in pain. Douglas dropped his hand, turned away, disappeared into a room without a sound. Mrs. Bella hadn't even noticed. She kept walking, kept talking about bleach ratios and which wood polish to use on which furniture. But Palmer wasn't listening anymore, because something in that boy's eyes had looked familiar, something that said, "Please, someone see me." And Palmer had seen him. God help her, she'd seen him. Real quick, pause and drop a comment below. Tell me if you've ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, but were told to stay silent. Share your thoughts. Because this community is built on people who refuse to look away. Palmer folded the paper bird during her lunch break on the third day. Her fingers remembered the movements without thinking. A square of white printer paper, creased at the corners, folded inward, wings pulled out, neck bent just right. A crane. She used to make them for Luis when they were kids. He'd line them up on his windowsill, like a flock of hope that might one day carry him somewhere better. She left it on Douglas's nightstand while cleaning his room, just set it there next to the lamp and walked away. Mrs. Bella's voice echoed in her head. Do not interact with the boy. But a paper bird wasn't interacting. It was just paper. It wasn't breaking the rules if no one saw it happen. The next day, the bird was gone from the nightstand. Palmer's heart sank. Maybe he threw it away. Maybe Mrs. Bella found it and tossed it in the trash. But then she saw it. On the windowsill, perched between a stack of books and a picture frame. He'd moved it. He'd kept it. That meant something. She left another bird the following Monday. This one was blue, folded from a page she'd torn from an old notebook. By Wednesday, it was sitting next to the white one on the windowsill. And underneath it, a small piece of paper with a pencil drawing. A smile. Just a curved line, simple and childlike. But it was a smile. Douglas had left her a message. Palmer's hands shook when she picked it up. For the first time since Cooper died, she felt like she mattered to someone, like she wasn't just a ghost moving through the world, invisible and forgotten. This boy, this lonely, hurting boy, had seen her too. Over the next 2 weeks, they built a language that didn't need sound. She folded birds in different colors, different poses. Wings up meant hello. Wings down meant goodbye. A crane with its head tucked meant thank you. Douglas started leaving notes. Not words, just drawings. The sun, a tree, a heart. Once he drew 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands. Palmer cried in the supply closet after she found that one. He started waiting for her. She'd walk into the library to dust the shelves, and he'd be there, sitting by the window, pretending to read. She'd enter the sitting room to vacuum, and he'd appear in the doorway, watching her with those dark, serious eyes. He never came too close, never tried to speak, but he was there, present, waiting for the one person in that entire mansion who saw him as more than a problem money couldn't solve. Douglas, who'd spent 9 years believing no one cared enough to understand him, finally felt seen. And Palmer, who'd spent 2 years drowning in grief and guilt, finally felt like she could breathe again. They were healing each other in secret, one paper bird at a time. If you're still watching, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. People who believe in courage over credentials, compassion over rules. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story, because this exact pattern of ordinary people doing extraordinary things shows up again and again, and the lessons Palmer teaches us here become even more powerful in the stories I'm covering next. Palmer found him in the rose garden on a Thursday afternoon. She wasn't supposed to be outside, but she'd seen him through the window, hunched over by the fountain, and something about the way he was sitting made her stomach drop. She put down her cleaning supplies and walked out through the French doors, knowing Mrs. Bella would fire her if she got caught. Douglas was crying, silently, the way he did everything. Tears running down his face while his mouth stayed closed. His right hand was pressed against his ear so hard his knuckles had gone white. His whole body was trembling. Palmer knelt beside him. She touched his shoulder gently, and he looked up at her with eyes that were drowning in pain. She pointed at his ear, then at herself, asking without words if she could look. He nodded, desperate, and tilted his head toward her. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. Her hands were shaking as she gently pulled his earlobe down and angled the light into the canal. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the normal pinkish interior of an ear. But then she looked deeper, past the first bend, and her breath caught in her throat. There was something in there, something dark and dense, lodged deep in the canal like it had been there for years. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't natural. It looked like a plug of tar and stone, irregular and jagged, glistening with moisture. The edges seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, or maybe that was just the light playing tricks. But it was there, solid, real, blocking everything. Palmer pulled back, her heart hammering. This wasn't nerve damage. This wasn't something he was born with. This was something stuck. Something foreign, something that had been sitting in his ear, pressing against his eardrum, causing pain that everyone had ignored because the doctors said it was impossible. How had they missed this? How had specialists with million-dollar equipment and decades of training looked at this boy and never thought to check for something so simple, so obvious? They'd run their scans and tests and declared him broken, and then they'd send him home to suffer. And his father had believed them, because what else could he do? You trust doctors. You trust experts. You trust the people who were supposed to know better. Douglas grabbed her hand. He pointed at his ear, then at her, then put his palms together like he was praying. Please. His eyes were begging her. Please help me. Please don't walk away like everyone else. Palmer looked at that boy, at the pain carved into his face, at the hope flickering in his eyes like a candle about to go out. And she knew. She knew that if she walked away now, if she told herself this wasn't her problem, this wasn't her responsibility, she'd never forgive herself. She'd be just like everyone else who'd failed him, just another person who saw the pain and chose to look away. Palmer spent that entire evening on her phone, searching. Foreign object in ear canal, impacted cerumen removal, untrained extraction risks. Every article she read made her stomach turn. Perforated eardrum, infection, hearing loss, brain damage, death. The words piled up like stones on her chest until she couldn't breathe. She could kill him. One wrong move, one slip of the hand, and that boy would be dead. And she'd go to prison. Mrs. Bella's voice echoed in her head. You'll go to prison. They'd charge her with assault, child endangerment, maybe manslaughter if something went wrong. Her grandmother would die alone in a state facility, and Douglas would still be suffering, except now it would be her fault. Palmer sat on the edge of her bed in her tiny apartment, staring at the wall. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to walk away. Tell Mr. Freeman what she'd seen. Let him take Douglas to another specialist. Let someone with a medical license handle it. That's what a reasonable person would do. But she'd seen the way Evan Freeman looked at his son. Hopeless, defeated. He'd already given up. He'd already spent 9 years trusting doctors who missed what she'd found with a phone flashlight in 30 seconds. She visited her grandmother that night at the nursing home. The place smelled like disinfectant and old age. Her grandmother sat by the window in her room, staring at nothing. Dementia had taken most of her memories, left her floating in a fog where the past and present blurred together. "Hi, Grandma," Palmer said, sitting beside her. Her grandmother turned, her eyes unfocused. Then she smiled. "Cooper, you came." Palmer's throat tightened. "It's me, Grandma." Palmer. But her grandmother reached out and touched her face, still smiling. "You were always brave when it mattered, even when you were scared, even when it hurt. You did the right thing." Palmer felt tears burning in her eyes. Cooper, her brother, the one who died because they couldn't afford help, the one she couldn't save. She drove home in silence, her grandmother's words ringing in her head. You were always brave when it mattered. But this wasn't bravery. This was insanity. This was risking everything for a boy she barely knew, a boy whose father could destroy her with a phone call. Palmer sat in her car outside her apartment for an hour, praying. She wasn't good at praying. She didn't go to church. She didn't read the Bible. but she closed her eyes and whispered into the dark. God, I don't know what to do. I'm scared. I'm so scared. And then the thought came, quiet and steady, like someone had placed it in her mind. God doesn't give us permission to do the right thing. He just puts us in the room and asks, "Will you?" Palmer opened her eyes. Her hands had stopped shaking. She knew what she had to do. It happened on a Friday. Palmer was cleaning the hallway when she heard the sound. Not a scream, because Douglas couldn't scream. Just a thud. Heavy, final. She dropped the mop and ran. Douglas was on the floor, his body jerking, eyes rolled back in his head, seizing. His right ear was bleeding, a thin trail of red running down his neck. Palmer dropped to her knees beside him, her heart slamming against her ribs. No time to call anyone, no time to think. She ran to the supply closet and grabbed the first aid kit, found the tweezers inside. Her hands shook as she poured rubbing alcohol over the metal, watching it drip onto the floor. This was insane. This was going to get her killed or arrested or both. But Douglas had stopped seizing and was lying there, gasping, his face twisted in agony. Palmer knelt beside him and pulled his head into her lap. "I'm here," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. "I'm going to help you." She turned on her phone's flashlight and angled it into his ear. The mass was right there, dark and glistening, pressed so deep it looked like part of him. She steadied her breathing, said a prayer she didn't have words for. Then she slid the tweezers into his ear canal. Douglas flinched, but he didn't pull away. He trusted her. God helped them both. He trusted her. The tips of the tweezers touched the edge of the mass. It was hard, denser than she'd expected, like touching a stone. She pressed gently, trying to get a grip, but it wouldn't budge. It was adhered to the canal wall, stuck there like it had grown roots. Sweat dripped down her face. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to stop and breathe. She tried again. This time, she angled the tweezers deeper, got a better hold, and pulled. Slowly, carefully. The mass resisted. Then it shifted. Just a fraction. Then more. Palmer pulled again, her entire body tense, and suddenly it gave. The plug came free, dark, dense, the size of a marble. Blood followed, more than she expected, running down Douglas's neck and onto her uniform. But she didn't care because Douglas gasped. His eyes went wide. He sat up, his hands flying to his ears. And then he heard it. The grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking, loud and steady and real. Douglas's mouth opened. His face went pale. He looked at Palmer, then at the clock, then back at Palmer. And he whispered, his voice rough and broken and beautiful, "Tick, tick, Dad?" The sound wasn't just noise. It was proof. Proof that the world was louder, brighter, more alive than he'd ever known. Proof that someone had finally listened. Then the door opened. Evan Freeman stood there, staring at his son's head in Palmer's lap, at the blood on her hands, at the tweezers still clutched in her fingers. And he screamed. Evan's scream cut through the air like a knife. "Get away from him!" He lunged forward, yanking Douglas away from Palmer. The boy stumbled, blood still dripping from his ear, his eyes wide with confusion. Evan held him tight, his hands checking for injuries, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then he saw Palmer, saw the blood on her uniform, saw the tweezers in her hand, saw his son's blood on the metal. "What did you do?" His voice was shaking. "What the hell did you do to my son?" Palmer opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Mrs. Bella appeared in the doorway with 2 security guards. Her face was cold, satisfied, like she'd been waiting for this moment since the day Palmer walked through the door. "I told you, Mr. Freeman," Mrs. Bella said, her voice dripping with vindication. She was trouble from the start. The security guards moved fast. They grabbed Palmer by the arms and hauled her to her feet. She didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't cry. She just looked at Douglas, who was pointing at his ears, trying to say something, his mouth forming words that his father wasn't hearing. "Call the police," Evan said, his voice breaking. "Call them now." Douglas was pulling on his father's sleeve, his face desperate. He was speaking, his voice raw and unfamiliar, trying to explain. Dad, she helped me." But Evan wasn't listening. He was staring at the blood, at the tweezers, at the woman who'd been in his house for less than a month. A stranger. Nobody. Someone he'd trusted to clean his floors, and she'd done this. She'd hurt his son. Palmer didn't try to explain. What was the point? She knew how this looked. She knew what they saw. A maid with no training, no credentials, standing over a bleeding child with a weapon in her hand. It didn't matter that she'd saved him. It didn't matter that she'd done what 9 years of specialists couldn't do. All that mattered was the blood. The guards dragged her toward the door. Palmer looked back one last time, met Douglas's eyes, and mouthed the words, "You're okay now." And Douglas, for the first time in his life, heard those words in his memory, not with his ears, but with something deeper. He heard her voice, soft and steady, telling him he mattered, telling him someone had finally cared enough to try. He knew what she'd risked. He knew what she'd given up. He screamed, not in pain, in protest. "Dad, stop! She didn't hurt me. She fixed me. Dad, please." But Evan wasn't listening. He was holding his son, feeling the blood on his hands, and all he could think was that he'd failed again. He'd let another person hurt the only thing he had left in this world. Palmer was gone before Douglas could make his father understand. Dr. Paul met them at the hospital. He was older, gray at the temples, with kind eyes that had seen too much. He examined Douglas carefully, checking the ear canal, running tests, ordering a CT scan. Evan stood by the wall, his arms crossed, watching every move, waiting for the doctor to confirm what he already knew, that the maid had damaged his son. But when Dr. Paul came back with the results, his face was pale. "The scan is clean. No perforation, no infection, no damage at all." Evan blinked. "What?" "Your son's eardrum is intact. The extraction was clean. Whoever did this shouldn't have had to do it. It was insanely dangerous. But she did everything right, exactly how we would have done it in a controlled room." "That's impossible. She's a maid. She has no training." Dr. Paul didn't respond. He was staring at the computer screen, scrolling through Douglas's old medical files. His jaw tightened. Then he stopped, clicked on something, and went very still. "Mr. Freeman," he said quietly, "I need you to see this." Evan walked over. Dr. Paul turned the screen toward him. It was a note dated 7 years ago from a consultation at Johns Hopkins. The words were clinical, detached, but they burned into Evan's brain like fire. "Junior ENT examination notes. Possible impacted foreign body visible in right ear canal. Appears to be surgical packing material. Recommend immediate extraction and imaging to confirm source. Senior consultant addendum. Findings attributed to congenital malformation of canal tissue. Foreign body ruled out. No extraction warranted. Recommend ongoing treatment protocol for congenital hearing loss." Evan read it 3 times. 4. His hands started shaking. "What does this mean?" Dr. Paul's voice was steady, but there was anger underneath. "It means a younger doctor saw something, flagged it, and a senior specialist overruled it. Then they buried that note under years of scans and consultations and therapies. Look at the billing codes, Mr. Freeman. They kept you on a treatment plan that generated revenue every single month." "But what was it? What did she pull out?" Dr. Paul pulled up an image on another screen. Based on the description from the paramedics and what I can see in the tissue sample, it was surgical packing material. A small piece of foam that should have been removed after a procedure when Douglas was an infant. It had been lodged in his ear canal for 9 years, hardening, blocking sound, causing chronic pain. And they knew. Or at least, someone did. The room tilted. Evan grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from falling. "They left something in my son's ear, and then they lied about it." "Not just lied. Look at this." Dr. Paul clicked to another screen. The junior doctor's original note said, "Extract immediately." But in the final summary report that went into your file, someone changed it. It just says, "Congenital malformation, no reversible cause." Someone went in and edited the record. "I spent $10 million. I took him to 3 continents. And you're telling me they knew?" Dr. Paul nodded. "I'm sorry. They saw it. They buried it. And they kept you paying." Evan's knees buckled. He sank into a chair, his face in his hands. 9 years. 9 years of watching his son suffer. 9 years of blaming himself, blaming God, blaming the universe for making his boy broken. And it was all a lie. They'd known. They'd known, and they'd let Douglas live in silence because it was more profitable than telling the truth. Douglas tugged on his sleeve. His voice was small, uncertain. Still learning how to use it. "Dad? Are you okay?" Evan looked up at his son, at the boy who could hear him now, the boy who'd been saved by someone Evan had almost destroyed. "Where is she?" Evan whispered. "Where's Palmer?" They found her in a holding room at the police station. She sat on a metal bench, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. She didn't look scared. She didn't look angry. She just looked tired. Evan walked in, and she stood up. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. So he did the only thing that made sense. He dropped to his knees in front of her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I've spent 9 years trying to buy a miracle, and God sent one through the woman I paid to clean my floors." Palmer stared at him, tears filling her eyes. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Evan looked up at her, this woman who'd risked everything for a boy she barely knew. "You saved my son. You pulled out what they left behind, what they hid, what they profited from, and I almost destroyed you for it." The door opened. Douglas ran in, his footsteps loud on the tile floor. He skidded to a stop in front of Palmer and threw his arms around her, and then he turned to his father, hearing Evan's voice for the first time in his life. "Dad," Douglas whispered, "you sound warm." Evan pulled them both into his arms and cried. 3 weeks later, Palmer started her new job. Not as a maid, as Douglas's full-time companion. Evan paid off her grandmother's nursing home bills for the next 5 years. He made sure she never had to scrub another floor unless she wanted to, because some things money can never buy. But a $14 an hour maid with a pair of tweezers and the courage to care, that can change the world. Click the video on your right to see 3 other stories where ordinary people with no credentials did what trained experts refused to do, the patterns they followed, and the one principle that connects them all. You'll see the courage it takes to trust your instincts, the cost of staying silent, and the exact moment when compassion becomes revolution. Don't miss it.